This gimbal is by far the best gimbal I have ever used on the Canon M50. This gimbal was sent out to me at no cost to myself, but this is not a paid or sponsored video, and all the opinions are my own. The things that make this gimbal so good, particularly using with the Canon M50, aren't in the specs. And so there's three things I want to go over, and do not underestimate the value of these three things. They are absolutely transformative when using this gimbal with this camera. And the first one is, it just works. And of course, we think it's a gimbal, we bought a gimbal, gimbals should work. What this one does, and all the new gimbals have this function, once you balance the camera on the gimbal, you go into the menu system, very easy to navigate menu system with the touch screen on this one. You go into that menu system and you hit auto configure. This does this sort of little wiggle routine where the gimbal actually works out the weight and the balance of the camera so it can determine the settings that it wants to use as far as the power of the motors and how they respond to movement. In theory, when this is done in any gimbal, you should then get ultra smooth footage. What I've found is in most gimbals, somewhere between 25% of the time and 80% of the time this actually works. With this gimbal, if you use the auto configure, it works every time. It's absolutely perfect. I've never had to go in and tweak a setting when using the auto configure. This is important because when you're in the field, it can be very hard to tell if you're actually getting smooth footage. And if one of those little motor strengths or smoothnesses needs to be adjusted, all of your footage can be pretty poor in the scheme of things, defeating the whole purpose of having a gimbal. The next thing is the quick release system. Now, if I want to change a memory card or if I want to change a battery, all I've got to do is pull this quick release and the camera comes off like this. It's that easy. The camera's off, I can access the battery, I can access the card, I can change everything. And then when I put the camera back on the gimbal, it's still balanced, and it was that quick. Also, I might want to just take it off and shoot handheld. I don't want to walk around with the gimbal all day. I've got the gimbal like this, I go along, I shoot handheld, I put it back on, and it's balanced. That is not always the case for most gimbals. In fact, I would say, I think every other gimbal I have, you actually have to make some sort of adjustment. You don't have a quick release like this. This means that you are at least partially rebalancing the gimbal every time you take the camera off the gimbal. What this does is it makes you not use the gimbal, which defeats the purpose of having the gimbal in the first place. Now, building on this quick release feature is the third thing that makes this such a revolutionary gimbal when using it with the Canon M50. It has what's called a part fold down mode. And you can see here, normally what would happen is this arm in most gimbals would swing through and sit above this. But to do that, you actually have to take this arm and slide it in. That takes it out of balance. This has a part fold down mode, so I click it like that. It sets like that. Now I can put this in my bag. I can put it in the water bottle holder on the outside of my bag. Now I've got quite a small package, but this gimbal is still balanced. This is still a balanced gimbal, just like it was when I took the camera off. So to set it back up, I do that. I flip this up. I flip this down. Camera's back on, and that's it. I'm back in balance. So this means that I can tear the whole thing down, put it in my bag, put it back on, and I don't have to rebalance it. This is particularly important. Well, it's important for anybody, but it's particularly important for new users because the number one complaint I hear from anybody when using new gimbals, specifically new users, is that they can be dicky and difficult to balance. And that is true. Until you've done it a few hundred times, it can be a bit of a pain, and it's absolutely the worst part about using a gimbal is doing the balance. But if you've got a few lenses or even a specific lens, like maybe the kit lens in this case, that you like to use, you can balance this with the kit lens. You're now set up, and you basically wouldn't ever have to balance it again unless you change lenses. So if you've got a favorite lens you're shooting with most of the time, balance it once, and you can fold it down like this and you don't have to balance it again. Now for me, that's what makes this gimbal so great. It's the usability. No other gimbal I've tested has this level of usability with this combination of features. Because I'm a full-time YouTuber now, I often have access to or know about better pricing on products like these gimbals. So all the products I've used to make this video, as well as the M3S gimbal, I will put a link in the description down below with the best prices or any discounts I know about. The performance of this gimbal is just about on par with the bigger gimbals. The bigger a gimbal gets, the longer the arms are, and the more its ability should be to level out that movement, because it can move more to take out more movement that is in the environment or is being put into the gimbal itself. Because of that, bigger gimbals are almost always more stable. But this gimbal is shockingly stable in a way that I really struggle to get my head around, and it outperforms a lot of my larger gimbals, particularly given it's so easy to configure with that auto configure mode that seems to work every time. The other thing, once again, particularly for new users, is the touchscreen. We're all used to using a touchscreen in our phones, and our cameras, what have you. And this the menu system is so simple. It's a color touchscreen. You can sort of pan up and down. The clicking works fine. It's very intuitive. It's very much like using a phone or the back of your camera or the M50 screen. Now the next one is size and weight. You're at 705 grams, 1.5 pounds. That is a real nice match with a small camera body like this. You don't want a situation where you've got the small portable camera, which is really nice, put it in a small bag, and then you end up with this gimbal that's so big that it almost needs its own separate bag. This is an appropriate size gimbal for the size of this camera. It also means that if you're going on holiday or you're going somewhere, you're not sure if you're gonna use the gimbal or not, because it's small, it's the gimbal that you'll take even if you're not 100% sure that you're gonna use it. With a bigger gimbal that's gonna require its own case or a separate bag, you're almost certainly gonna leave that one at home. You've also got enormous battery life on this thing. It's rated to around 8 hours, but the rating is actually just with the gimbal sitting in place holding the camera without any movement. Obviously, when you move it, the battery life, it uses the battery more, so your battery life is shorter. So I think real world battery life on this gimbal is probably somewhere around the 3 to 4 to 5 hour mark. And what you'll find is you're probably not gonna walk around for 3 or 4 or 5 hours. So when I take this gimbal with me on holiday, family travel, what have you, what I'm finding is I'm charging it up the beginning of 1 week, and the amount that I use it, I can pretty much go a full week of family holidays and I don't have to recharge it. So the battery life is long enough that it's a charge once for an entire week-long trip, at least for me. The other thing you're gonna get is the ability to stop and start your video recording from the gimbal. This can be done both with the Bluetooth wireless connection or with a wired connection into the camera itself. And this has never really bothered me, and most of the time I don't even bother messing with this with my gimbals. I just push the button on the camera. But I know a lot of people, this is a really, really big deal and a really important feature to them. And this is one thing that has been upgraded from the previous Crane M3. The Crane M3S can actually control the camera, whereas the Crane M3, the original model, could not do that. The other thing you're gonna get, and it's not something that I use very often, but it's there if you need it, and it's just part of the gimbal, consider it a bonus feature, and that is the light. Now this is a 1000 lux light. It goes from a color temperature of 2700 to 5500, and if you're in a situation where you just need a little bit of extra brightness on your subject in a sort of dimly lit situation or a sunset or something like that, you can just turn this on, turn it to sort of a warm golden color temperature, and it'll just light up the subject's face just enough to make that footage a little bit cleaner and a little bit more usable. Now, the other question I'm gonna get a lot is what is the difference between the M3S and the M2S, and which would you choose? Now, this is the way I think we need to look at it. The M2S is a smartphone or phone gimbal that's been souped up enough that it can take a mirrorless camera like the Canon M50. The Crane M3S is like a big pro level gimbal that's been shrunk down and can be used with the Canon M50. What I would say is across the board, build quality, performance, user interface, overall experience, the M3S is a much, much nicer gimbal. But the M2S will still work with the Canon M50, and the performance is reasonably good and it is cheaper. The only reason I would go with the M2S is if you are on a budget and you're on a very tight budget, and this is really all you can afford. If you can afford the extra for the M3S, I absolutely think it's worth it. Now, using this gimbal is definitely gonna get you better video footage out of your Canon M50. But if you want to improve your photography skills and you're never sure which setting to use, I've just thrown a video on screen now. This is the best tutorial that I have ever done on photography. And I think particularly for beginners, at the end of that video, you will be a better photographer than you are right now.